Welcome, travelers of time. Close your eyes and imagine drifting along the serene banks of the Nile, where golden fields of wheat sway gently in the breeze, and the rhythm of life unfolds in harmony with the river. Here, along these waters, agriculture and civilization grew hand in hand, shaping the stories of ancient Egypt. Let us journey together into this world, where every grain of soil and drop of water holds a tale waiting to be told. Long before the sun rose over the horizon, the Nile stretched silently across the land, winding through deserts, plains, and small hills. Its water reflected the pale morning sky, soft and still. Villages made of mud brick houses lined its banks, each with flat roofs and small chimneys. Smoke from clay ovens spiraled into the sky, carrying the scent of bread baking from the previous night. The air was cool, filled with the earthy smell of the river and the reeds that grew along its edges. Fishermen had already set out in small boats, their oars dipping rhythmically into the calm waters. The occasional splash echoed along the river, blending with the soft call of birds waking for the day. Children crouched near the water, their hands brushing the cool surface, watching tiny fish dart between reeds. Their laughter was quiet, careful not to disturb the rhythm of life that the river carried with it. Women moved through the village paths, carrying clay jars of water from the canals. Their feet were careful on the uneven ground, skirts brushing the mud brick walls. In small gardens behind the houses, they tended onions, leeks, lentils, and other vegetables. Their hands moved slowly and deliberately, planting, watering, and weeding. Every motion had a rhythm, echoing the steady rise and fall of the Nile, as if the river itself guided their work. Men guided oxen toward the fields, checking ropes and yokes to make sure everything was secure. The animals moved with patient strength, their heavy hooves pressing into the soft, fertile soil. The men spoke softly, murmuring instructions that had been passed down for generations. They did not hurry. The rhythm of the land dictated the pace. The villagers' animals were part of this rhythm as well. Goats grazed on the edges of the canals, nibbling tender shoots. Chickens pecked at the ground near the houses. Dogs lay in shaded corners, alert but relaxed, understanding the calm patterns of village life. Even cats moved quietly along rooftops, their eyes reflecting the morning light as they searched for small birds or hidden mice. By mid-morning, the sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the fields. The air warmed, and the river shimmered with golden reflections. Farmers adjusted their plows, checking the wooden blades for wear. Children ran along the paths, playing games that mirrored the work of their parents, mimicking sowing seeds or guiding oxen, learning the rhythm of the land through play. Near the riverbank, small boats carried bundles of reeds and fresh fish. Men and women worked together to unload the cargo, stacking the reeds carefully and cleaning the fish for the markets. The sounds were gentle, the splash of water, the shuffle of feet on mud, the soft murmur of conversation. There was no rush. Everything moved in harmony with the river's pace, as it had for countless generations. Alongside the villages, small shrines marked the riverbanks, places where the villagers offered bread, flowers, or water. These offerings were gestures of respect for the forces they observed in nature, forces they thought controlled the flooding, the sun, and the growth of crops. They were not worshipping as a true god, but honoring patterns in the world that brought life. By afternoon, the village had settled into a slow, steady rhythm. Oxen labored in the fields, hands guided the plows, water was drawn from canals, and seeds were scattered carefully in the rich soil. Children rested under the shade of palm trees, watching their parents and imitating small tasks. The air smelled of warm earth and drying reeds, mixed with the subtle aroma of cooking bread and lentils. As the sun began to lower, shadows lengthened across the fields. Women gathered vegetables and herbs, carrying them carefully to the kitchens. Men led oxen back to the pens. checking the ropes and tying them securely. The river, wide and calm, reflected the changing colors of the sky. Birds flew home to the reed beds, and fish slipped silently through the water below. Evening brought a quiet hush. Families ate together, sharing meals of bread, lentils, vegetables, and fish. The children listened to the elders' stories of past floods and the cycles of planting and harvest. There was a deep peace in this life, work, rest, and connection to the river that made everything possible. By nightfall, the village slept under a sky sprinkled with stars, the Nile flowing steadily nearby, carrying the gentle rhythm of life into the darkness. Each year, as the summer heat intensified in distant deserts and mountains, the Nile began its slow but unstoppable rise. The river, calm for months, swelled with water brought from distant rains and melting snow. Villagers watched the water levels carefully, noting the subtle changes in the river's color and movement. A faint ripple one morning could signal the beginning of a flood that would transform the lands, bringing both risk and promise. Farmers prepared their fields weeks in advance. Men inspected the embankments, repairing any cracks and reinforcing walls with mud and straw. Oxen were guided to higher ground to avoid being swept away, while goats and sheep were herded into safer pens. Families collected grains and valuables from low-lying areas, moving them to elevated storage huts. Women packed food, pottery, and essential tools, knowing that for days, their routines would change with the river's whims. Children were fascinated by the rising waters. They watched as the gentle waves began to creep closer to the fields, imagining boats floating across the newly forming canals. Some played along the riverbank, dipping sticks into the water and watching the ripples expand. Their laughter mingled with the soft cries of birds and the distant calls of men guiding animals to safety. As the floodwaters continued to rise, the air was filled with both excitement and tension. Villagers moved with purpose, yet their movements retained the calm rhythm of daily life. Women carried jars of water and bundles of reeds, balancing them carefully on their heads. Men inspected the fields, measuring the depth of the water, predicting which plots would benefit most and which might be damaged. This annual event, both feared and cherished, dictated the pace of life along the river. Boats became essential during the flood. Small wooden vessels floated along temporary canals, carrying grain, vegetables, and other necessities. Farmers navigated these waterways with skill, balancing their loads and maneuvering around the occasional tree or fence that had been submerged. The river, once a predictable force, now became an active partner in their work, guiding the villagers' actions with each gentle current. Near the heart of the villages, families gathered in elevated courtyards to watch the water. Elders told stories of past floods, recounting years when the river brought bounty and times when it brought devastation. Children listened intently, learning to respect the water, to observe its moods, and to understand that the river's power could never be fully tamed. Fields began to transform, low-lying areas filled with water, creating temporary wetlands. Fish entered these new pools, offering fresh food. Fertile silt, carried from upstream, spread over the soil, enriching it for the next planting season. The villagers knew that soon they would plant new crops in these refreshed lands, continuing the endless cycle of life dictated by the Nile. Evenings during the flood were different. The soft light of the setting sun reflected off the widened river, creating shimmering patterns across the village. Fires were lit, and smoke spiraled into the sky, mingling with the moist, earthy air. Families shared meals, their conversations hushed, mindful of the river's constant presence. The children, exhausted from the day's observations and activities, fell asleep easily, lulled by the gentle sound of flowing water nearby. The flood was more than water. It was a teacher, a force of nature that demanded respect. It reminded the villagers of the delicate balance between work and patience, between fear and gratitude. And as night fell, the river glimmered under the stars, carrying the hopes, dreams, and daily labors of countless generations along its unending course. After the great flood had retreated and the Nile's waters quietly returned to their main channel, the wide river banks were transformed into a living canvas of dark, glistening earth. The rich silt, carried for hundreds of miles by the river's powerful current, now lay spread across the fields. It was thick and moist, the kind of soil that could cradle seeds like a mother holding a child. To the ancient Egyptians, this moment marked not only a change of season but a renewal of life itself. The planting season was a time of both great labor and quiet hope. Families across the villages prepared for long days in the fields, for every grain of wheat or barley placed into the ground represented the promise of tomorrow's bread. The cycle was as old as memory: flood, retreat, planting, harvest. Yet each year it felt new, as if the land had once again chosen to share its strength with the people. Men awoke before the sun had risen, gathering their tools: plows fashioned from wood, baskets woven from reeds, and long-handled hoes smoothed by years of use. Oxen, patient and heavy, were led from their pens to the fields, their hides glistening with morning dew. The animals moved slowly, their hooves sinking into the damp earth, leaving behind steady prints that marked the rhythm of the season. Children, still drowsy from sleep, clung to their mothers' hands, carrying small bundles of seed in baskets too large for their arms, when the first light of dawn spilled across the horizon. The work began. Farmers guided oxen to pull the plows through the soft ground, carving long furrows in the soil. Behind them, men and women walked with baskets, scattering seeds in careful arcs. Each handful of grain was thrown with measured precision, practiced through years of repetition. The motion was graceful, almost like a dance and unspoken choreography where each person knew their place. The seeds themselves carried stories. Wheat was the staff of life, ground into flour for bread that sustained every household. Barley, coarser but plentiful, was used not only for food but for brewing beer, a daily drink that quenched thirst and lifted spirits. Flax, with its slender stalks, promised linen for clothing and sails for boats that glided along the Nile. Every type of seed had its purpose, and so the baskets were never filled with just one crop, but with a mixture that reflected both necessity and foresight. Elders often sat on the edges of the fields. Their voices rising in gentle instruction, they reminded the younger ones not to cast the seeds too thickly or too thinly, for either mistake could spoil the harvest. They recalled years when the floods were too small, leaving the soil dry and cracked, and years when the waters had drowned the seeds before they could sprout. Their stories were warnings wrapped in wisdom, carried on the wind to the ears of those who worked. As the morning deepened into afternoon, they are filled with the scent of turned earth. Birds circled above, watching for seeds left uncovered. To protect their work, children ran across the furrows clapping their hands, chasing away flocks of sparrows. The laughter of the young mingled with the steady rhythm of the tools striking soil. Despite the labor, the mood was not one of hardship but of unity. For the entire community moved together with a shared goal to bring life back to the land. The Nile itself was never far from their thoughts. Even as they planted, the people glanced toward the shining ribbon of water, grateful for the flood that had nourished their soil. Before the season began, some families placed small offerings at the river's edge, handfuls of grain, or a cup of beer as tokens of respect to the life-giving waters. They did not believe the river was a god, but they did believe it carried the will of nature, and to honor it was to acknowledge their dependence on its cycles. Evenings during planting season were filled with quiet contentment. After long hours under the sun, families returned to their mud brick homes. Meals were simple: bread baked from last year's harvest, lentil stew simmered with garlic and onions, perhaps a bit of dried fish. By the glow of oil lamps, parents spoke softly to their children, telling them that the seeds buried in the earth were like sleeping treasures, waiting for the warmth of the sun to awaken them. The children, tired from the day, drifted into sleep with visions of golden fields in their minds. For the people of ancient Egypt, planting was never merely about food. It was about continuity, the link between past and future. Each seed was a memory of those who had come before, and a promise to those yet to be born. The act of sowing bound families to the soil, villages to the river, and the present moment to eternity. When the planting season came to its close, the fields along the Nile lay covered with invisible treasures, countless seeds resting just beneath the surface of the soil. At first, the land seemed quiet, almost bare, as if nothing had changed. But those who had worked the earth knew that the fields were alive with hidden potential. They only needed time, warmth, and patience before the first delicate green shoots would push their way toward the light. The days that followed were filled with anticipation. Families rose each morning and walked past their fields, searching the earth for signs of growth. The soil, still dark and damp from the receding floods, carried a fragrance that seemed to promise life. When the first sprouts appeared, tiny blades of green piercing through the black silt shears spread through the villages. Children pointed and laughed, mothers smiled, and fathers knelt down to touch the fragile plants with reverence. Each sprout was a symbol of hope, a message that the river had blessed their labor. Life in the villages now revolved around tending the young crops. Farmers carefully checked the fields, watching for uneven growth or patches where seeds had failed to sprout. If certain areas remained bare, families would sow extra seeds by hand, ensuring that no part of the land went to waste. The care they showed was meticulous, for they understood that a single season of neglect could mean hunger when the year turned. Irrigation became the central task. Though the flood had left the soil moist, it would not remain so forever. Small canals dug from the Nile's edge carried water to the fields, guided by hand-built channels and clay gates. Men used shadoofs, simple wooden poles with buckets tied to one end and a counterweight on the other to lift water from the river. Hour after hour they dipped and swung the buckets, pouring life into the thirsty earth. The sound of water splashing into channels became as familiar as birdsong or rhythm of survival. Children often helped by carrying smaller jars of water, or by patrolling the edges of the canals to keep them clear of debris. Women gathered reeds to reinforce the banks, preventing them from collapsing under the weight of the water. Everyone contributed, from the oldest to the youngest, because the growth of the fields was a matter of survival for all. As the sprouts grew taller, the villages came alive with new routines. Goats and cattle were carefully kept away from the tender fields, watched over by shepherds who led the animals to graze on the edges of the floodplain. Farmers spent hours in the fields, pulling weeds by hand to protect the young crops. Evenings were filled with conversation about how the plants looked, whether they seemed strong, whether they stood tall, whether the leaves shone with healthy color. The fields themselves became a place of gathering. Families walked among the rows, admiring the green carpet that spread across the once barren ground. The sight was calming, a living reminder that hard work and the river's cycles could turn emptiness into abundance. For those who had lived through years of poor floods, each field of sprouts was nothing short of a miracle. Nighttime in the villages during the growing season carried its own sense of peace. After a day of tending the fields, families sat together outside their homes, the smell of damp earth drifting on the breeze. Lamps flickered in the darkness as people shared stories, some about past harvests, others about the dreams they held for the future. Children, tired from helping, leaned against their parents and slowly slipped into sleep, lulled by the soft hum of voices and the distant murmur of the Nile. To the ancient Egyptians, watching the crops grow was an act of faith. The sprouts reminded them that the land was generous, but also fragile. Their survival rested on care, vigilance, and the steady rhythm of the river. And so they tended the fields with devotion, knowing that every blade of wheat was more than food. As the long months of tending the fields passed, the young sprouts had transformed into towering stalks of wheat and barley. Under the relentless Egyptian sun, the fields gleamed with golden hues, each blade of grain heavy with the promise of sustenance. The once empty furrows now seemed like rivers of gold, moving gently with the breeze. The Nile, ever faithful, had nurtured the land once more, allowing the people to witness the culmination of their months of labor, the harvest. Preparation for the harvest began days in advance. Families inspected their tools, sharpening sickles and knives, weaving fresh baskets, and repairing wooden carts. The elders discussed plans for the work. Allocating tasks to each family member, men were assigned to cut and bundle the grain, women to separate the wheat from the chaff, and children to gather fallen stalks or carry smaller loads. Even the youngest, not yet able to lift a full basket, ran between the rows, guiding animals and chasing away birds that threatened the tender crop before the first cut was made. Families gathered near the fields to offer thanks. Though the Egyptians did not worship the river as a god, they recognized the life it gave, and a small offering, grain, beer, or a simple gesture was left at the riverbank. It was an acknowledgement of the delicate balance between human effort and natural generosity, a reminder that without the Nile's cycles, the golden fields would remain a dream. When the sun rose on the first day of harvest, the villages came alive. The air was filled with the sound of sickles slicing through stalks, baskets rattling as they were filled with bundles of grain, and the steady clatter of wooden carts carrying the produce to storage. The farmers moved in organized lines, each step calculated, each motion honed over years of experience. The rhythm was mesmerizing, a dance performed with precision and devotion. Connecting the hands of the young to the wisdom of the elders, women worked alongside the men, their hands swift and practiced. After the stalks were cut, they separated edible grain from the chaff. This was done by tossing the mixture into the air and letting the wind carry away the lighter husks, leaving the precious kernels behind. Children, initially playful, soon joined in, carrying small loads and collecting fallen stalks. The labor was hard, yet there was laughter and music. Songs of the Nile and of the past harvests were sung, echoing across the plains as a reminder that the work of today connected generations. Bundles of grain were carefully tied and transported. Donkeys and oxen were loaded with the harvest, navigating the narrow paths between fields. The grain was carried to mud brick granaries, large enough to store enough food to sustain the village for months. Guards were stationed to protect the stores from thieves and animals, for a lost harvest could mean famine. Inside the granaries, the smell of fresh grain mingled with the warmth of the sun-baked bricks, creating a comforting, almost sacred atmosphere. Each day during harvest brought its own challenges. Heat and exhaustion were constant companions, and yet the people continued, driven by knowledge that every bundle of grain represented life, security, and hope. In the evening, tired hands and sunburnt faces gathered around modest fires. Meals of fresh bread, lentil stew, and beer brewed from barley were shared, each bite reminding them of the fruits of their labor. The children fell asleep to the quiet murmur of the Nile and the stories of the elders, dreaming of golden fields and the coming season. Some of the harvest was set aside as tribute. Officials arrived to measure the pharaoh's share, ensuring that the kingdom's needs were met. While some grumbled, most understood that the river's bounty was both personal and collective, sustaining not just individual families, but the entire civilization. The grain collected for the state supported monumental projects, temples, canals, and the maintenance of armies. This balance of giving and taking was the lifeblood of Egypt. Beyond the practicalities, harvest season was also a time of reflection and celebration. Villages held small feasts in the evenings, sharing stories and songs of past years. Children played with garlands of flowers, women decorated their eyes with coal, and men told jokes around the fire. It was a time to pause and marvel at what human effort, combined with the steady cycles of the Nile, could achieve. The golden fields were more than sustenance. They were a testament to patience, endurance, and harmony with nature. As the final bundles were secured, families looked over the fields with satisfaction. They knew that they had done their part, and that the river, in its endless rhythm, would continue to nurture life. In the glow of the setting sun, the fields shimmered like liquid gold, and the people of Egypt felt the deep and spoken connection between their hands, the soil, and the waters that gave them life. Every stalk of wheat, every kernel of barley, was a story of survival, a legacy of devotion, and a promise of tomorrow. As the last bundles of grain were secured in the granaries and the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, the villages of Egypt prepared for one of the most cherished times of the year, the festivals. Celebrating the Nile. These gatherings were not merely entertainment. They were moments of reflection, gratitude, and communal joy, marking the river's life-giving gifts and the people's enduring connection to it. The preparation began days before the festival. Streets were cleaned, mud brick homes were repaired, and children practiced dances that had been passed down for generations. Women adorned their hair with fresh flowers, and men polished the wooden tools and ceremonial items that would accompany the celebrations. The smell of bread baking and beer brewing filled the air, mingling with the scents of incense and river reeds, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and festivity. The festival itself was a symphony of sights, sounds, and smells. Villagers gathered at the river banks, where boats adorned with colorful banners floated gently on the water. The Nile shimmered under the sunlight, reflecting the vibrant colors of the banners and the clothing of the people. Children ran along the edges, laughing and chasing one another, while elders shared stories of past floods, bountiful harvests, and the wisdom that the river's cycles had taught them. Music played a central role in the celebrations. Flutes, drums, and lyres created a rhythm that seemed to echo the pulse of the river itself. People clapped, sang, and danced, moving in patterns that had been practiced for decades. The movements were more than entertainment. They were a form of respect, a way to honor the river and the life it supported. Even the animals, goats and cattle, were gently guided to participate, adding their own soft noises to the symphony. Food was abundant during the festival. Long tables were set up along the river banks, laden with fresh bread, roasted fish, dates, figs, lentil stews, and beer made from the recently harvested barley. Families shared their meals, offering portions to neighbors and travelers alike. The act of sharing reinforced communal bonds, reminding everyone that the river's gifts were meant for all, and that generosity ensured the survival of the community. One of the most important parts of the festival was the ceremonial boat procession, a small boat, filled with offerings of grain, beer, and flowers, was sent down the Nile as a symbolic gesture of thanks. People lined the banks to watch, cheering and clapping as the boat drifted along, carrying the collective hopes and gratitude of the village. This ritual connected the physical labor of the harvest with spiritual and cultural expressions of thanks, blending the tangible and intangible aspects of life along the river. Storytelling also played a significant role. Around the evening fires, elders recounted tales of heroes, legendary pharaohs, and the wisdom of ancestors. Children listened with wide eyes, absorbing the lessons woven into each story, lessons about courage, patience, and the importance of harmony with nature. The stories reminded everyone that the Nile was more than water. It was the lifeblood of their civilization, a force that required respect, care, and gratitude. As night fell, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the riverbanks. Songs continued, laughter echoed, and families lingered late into the evening, reluctant to let go of the joy and unity that the festival brought. Even as people returned to their homes, the spirit of the Nile lingered in their hearts. It was a season of rest, celebration, and connection, a moment to remember that human effort and the river's generosity together created a cycle of life that would continue for generations. The festival was also a time of preparation for the coming year. While the celebrations marked the end of the harvest, they also reminded the villagers that the Nile cycle would soon begin again. Seeds would need to be sown, water carefully managed, and the soil tended once more. The lessons of the festival, gratitude, patience, communal effort, were not just for enjoyment. They were a guide for survival, woven into the very fabric of everyday life along the river. Through these rituals, the Egyptians reinforced their understanding of balance between labor and leisure, effort and reward, giving and receiving. The Nile was at the center of this balance, its predictable rise and fall guiding the rhythm of their lives. By honoring it through feasts, music, dance, and storytelling, they ensured that each season's work was acknowledged, appreciated, and celebrated. Even in the quiet moments between songs and dances, there was a sense of connection. Children sat on their parents' laps, feeling the warmth of the fire, while the elders' voices narrated the continuity of life. Couples walked along the river banks, hands intertwined, reflecting on the year past and the hopes for the year to come. Every act, from offering food to sharing a story, from singing to silent reflection, reinforced the profound relationship between humans and the Nile. The festival was a reminder that life along the river was a delicate dance of cause and effect. The success of the harvest depended on months of labor, careful observation, and respect for the land and water. Celebration was not indulgence, it was acknowledgement. It was a way for the people to express their gratitude for the river's bounty and their commitment to the cycles that sustained them. As the night deepened and the lanterns flickered low, families returned to their homes, hearts full and spirits lifted. The songs of the festival lingered in their minds, blending with the natural sounds of the Nile flowing water, rustling reeds, and the distant calls of birds. In the quiet that followed, the people of Egypt slept with the knowledge that they were part of a long, continuous story, one in which human care and nature's generosity were inseparably intertwined. As the evening deepened, the celebrations grew more intimate. Families gathered around small fires along the riverbank, the flames casting flickering shadows on faces full of joy and satisfaction. The sound of laughter mingled with the gentle lap of water against the boats, creating a harmony that seemed to embrace every villager. Songs passed down through generations were sung, each note carrying the weight of history and the memory of countless festivals before. Children sat on the laps of their parents or grandparents, listening intently to tales of courage, wisdom, and the cleverness of past generations. These stories were more than entertainment, they were lessons, embedding respect for the land, the river, and community in the young minds. Elders spoke of the times when floods had failed, of droughts that tested resilience, and of harvests that restored hope. In this way, each festival became a living classroom, where the rhythms of life along the Nile were both celebrated and taught. The night also brought games and performances. Acrobatics, mimicry, and dances demonstrated strength, agility, and creativity, delighting audiences of all ages. Even those too old to participate watched with pride, recognizing the continuity of tradition in every movement. The performances reminded everyone that life along the Nile was not only survival, it was artistry, culture, and the joy of being together as a community. Food remained central to the evening. Platters of roasted fish, fresh bread, lentils, and fruits were shared freely, with neighbors invited to taste and partake. Beer, brewed from the newly harvested barley, flowed generously, a symbol of the river's generosity and the labor of the people. Sharing these meals reinforced bonds and ensured that no one went hungry during the celebrations. The act of eating together was a ritual of unity, connecting families to one another and to the land that had sustained them. Another highlight was the ceremonial offering to the river. Small boats carried grain, beer, and flowers downstream, and villagers lined the banks to witness the ritual. This gesture symbolized gratitude and humility, acknowledging the river's role in providing life. Each offering was a promise to care for the land, to respect its cycles, and to ensure the next generation would continue the work of their ancestors. As midnight approached, lanterns dimmed but spirits remained bright. Couples walked along the banks, reflecting on the bounty of the year and their hopes for the future. Quiet conversations shared in the soft light deepened relationships, while children, exhausted from play and activity, slept peacefully beside their parents. The festival was a bridge between generations, between labor and leisure, and between the tangible and spiritual aspects of life along the Nile. In the early hours, as the festival wound down, the villagers turned their attention to planning for the next season. Seeds would soon be sown, canals repaired, and fields prepared for the river's next cycle. The festival had reminded them of the interdependence of effort and reward. The joy of celebration was inseparable from the toil of the harvest, and gratitude was intertwined with survival. By dawn, the riverbanks were quiet once more. The boats drifted gently, the fires burned low, and the village returned to its regular rhythm. Yet the festival had left its mark, hearts full, spirits lifted, and a renewed understanding that life along the Nile was a delicate balance of labor, community, and the generosity of nature. The celebrations were not simply entertainment, they were a living testament to the enduring bond between humans and the river that sustained them. Through music, dance, storytelling, and ritual, the Egyptians acknowledged the vital cycles that shaped their lives. The Nile was more than water, it was the axis around which their world turned. Providing sustenance, security, and continuity, each festival strengthened this connection, reminding every villager of their role in the great tapestry of life along the river. As the final lanterns were extinguished, the night fell into silence, yet in the hearts of the villagers, the festival's warmth lingered. Children awoke in dreams of golden fields, parents whispered hopes for a fruitful season, and the elders smiled, knowing that the knowledge and traditions of the Nile would continue. Carried forward by hands both young and old, life along the river was a story of endurance, gratitude, and shared effort, a story celebrated not just in words, but in every song, dance, and meal. Along the fertile banks of the Nile, the success of agriculture depended not only on the generosity of the river but also on the ingenuity of the people who worked the land. The Egyptians were skilled observers of nature, and over centuries they developed a variety of tools and techniques that maximized productivity and ensured the survival of their communities. From the earliest stages of planting, farmers relied on simple but effective instruments. Wooden plows, often drawn by oxen, broke the soil and prepared it for seeds. These plows, though basic in design, allowed fields to be tilled efficiently, creating furrows that guided water from the Nile across the land. The careful design of the plow and the strength of the animals pulling it were critical. If the furrows were too shallow or too deep, the crops might fail. Hand tools were equally important. Sickles with curved blades allowed workers to harvest grain quickly and with precision, while hoes and mattocks loosened the soil, removed weeds, and helped shape irrigation channels. Even children contributed, carrying small baskets of seed or helping with simple tasks. Learning through hands-on experience the relationship between labor, soil, and the river's cycles. Irrigation was perhaps the most remarkable innovation along the Nile. Canals and dikes were constructed to control the river's floodwaters, directing them into fields and ensuring that water reached crops evenly. Shafts, simple counterweighted devices, lifted water from canals and poured it into smaller irrigation channels, allowing distant fields to thrive. Farmers timed their planting to the annual rise and fall of the river, understanding that careful observation of natural patterns was as important as any tool in their hands. Crop rotation and soil management were also advanced for the time. Farmers recognized that planting the same crop in the same field year after year would deplete nutrients. They alternated wheat and barley, leaving some fields fallow to restore fertility. Manure and composted plant material enriched the soil, providing a steady supply of nutrients that the river alone could not supply. Knowledge of the land and careful record-keeping ensured that each season yielded sufficient food. To sustain the community, storage techniques were another key innovation. Granaries, built from mud bricks and elevated slightly above ground, protected grain from moisture and pests. Ventilation shafts allowed air to circulate, preventing mold, while narrow doorways limited access to prevent theft. These granaries reflected not only practical knowledge but also a deep understanding of the importance of preserving the harvest for times of scarcity. The Egyptians also experimented with crop varieties. Some fields were dedicated to wheat best suited for bread, others to barley for beer, and still others to flax for linen. Each crop had its own requirements for soil, water, and planting depth. Farmers observed the land and the plants carefully, making adjustments from year to year to ensure optimal growth. This attention to detail demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of agriculture that balanced tradition with experimentation. Tools and techniques were not static. They evolved as farmers exchanged knowledge across villages and generations. Apprentices learned from elders, copying their methods, asking questions, and testing improvements. Over time, small adjustments, sharper blades, improved irrigation channels. Better storage methods compounded into significant advancements that shaped the prosperity of the Nile Valley. Even rituals and religious practices intersected with agriculture. While the Egyptians recognized only one true God, Allah, they still maintained ceremonies acknowledging the cycles of nature, giving thanks for rainfall, river flooding, and the fertility of the soil. These cultural observances reinforced the practical knowledge of planting and harvesting, integrating spiritual awareness with empirical understanding. The combination of innovation, observation, and communal labor meant that agriculture along the Nile was not merely survival. It was a system of knowledge, technique, and culture. The tools in the hands of farmers, from plows to shafts, from sickles to granaries, were extensions of human skill, channeling the power of nature into sustenance, security, and civilization. By mastering these techniques, the Egyptians could predict and manage the cycles of life along the river. They knew when to sow, when to irrigate, and when to harvest. Their understanding of tools, soil, and water allowed them to transform the unpredictable forces of the Nile into a reliable source of food and stability, ensuring that each generation could build upon the work of the previous one. Beyond the basic plows, sickles, and shafts, the ingenuity of Egyptian farmers extended to a variety of supplementary tools that made their work more efficient and less physically exhausting. Baskets woven from reeds were carefully constructed to carry both seeds and harvested grain. Their design allowed for airflow, preventing mold during transport and storage. Farmers learned through trial and error how to weave these baskets tightly enough to hold their contents securely yet lightly enough for ease of carrying over long distances. Irrigation techniques also involved careful observation of the river and landscape. Some fields required small ditches and channels to direct water precisely, while others relied on larger canals fed directly from the main river. Seasonal timing was critical. Too early or too late, and crops could be damaged. Farmers noticed the subtle changes in soil moisture, the direction of prevailing winds, and the color of young plants to determine the perfect moment for irrigation. This intimate connection with the land meant that every decision was informed by both experience and observation, making farming as much an art as a science. Labor organization was another innovation. Villages coordinated collective work, ensuring that plowing, planting, and harvesting occurred efficiently. Adults and children alike were assigned tasks suited to their abilities. While men and older boys handled the more strenuous activities, women performed delicate tasks such as separating seeds or maintaining tools. Children learned skills gradually, observing and imitating the adults, understanding that their participation was essential to the survival and prosperity of the community. Technology was further complemented by knowledge passed through generations. Farmers kept track of which fields had yielded the best crops, noting soil types, past water levels, and exposure to sunlight. This empirical knowledge guided decisions about crop rotation, fertilizer application, and planting patterns. Observation of natural cycles, combined with careful record-keeping, allowed Egyptians to refine their agricultural methods continuously. Even the smallest tools were designed with precision. Wooden rakes leveled the soil after plowing, while small hoes loosened earth around delicate seedlings. Every hand tool was an extension of the farmer's skill, enabling efficiency and care simultaneously. The shaft, though simple in concept, was a marvel of balance and physics, demonstrating that ingenuity could harness the river's power to reach fields far from its banks. Farmers also developed techniques to protect their crops from pests and environmental hazards. Birds and rodents threatened stored grain, so scarecrows, traps, and vigilant guarding were employed. Covering seeds during planting and using natural repellents helped protect young shoots. Even simple innovations, such as elevating granaries on mud brick platforms, reflected an understanding of physics and biology that safeguarded precious resources. Community cooperation extended beyond immediate villages. Knowledge of successful techniques spread through trade and social gatherings. When one village discovered a more efficient method of water distribution or a new way to preserve grain, neighboring villages adopted and adapted these techniques. This continuous exchange ensured that Egyptian agriculture evolved collectively, benefiting from both individual innovation and shared wisdom. The Egyptians' approach to agriculture was holistic. They recognized that soil fertility, water management, tool design, and communal effort were interconnected. A failure in one aspect could jeopardize the entire harvest. Conversely, attention to detail and careful management ensured not just survival, but abundance. Children learned these lessons by participating in every stage, understanding that their daily actions had long-term consequences for the community. Even celebrations were intertwined with agricultural knowledge. Festivals after the harvest reinforced the importance of irrigation and proper planting techniques. Through music, dance, and storytelling, practical lessons about the land and river were encoded in the culture, ensuring that the knowledge was preserved and passed down. In this way, the Egyptians integrated labor, observation, and communal memory into every aspect of life along the Nile. The combination of simple tools, sophisticated observation, and coordinated community work allowed Egyptian agriculture to flourish. Fields that once seemed dependent solely on the river's favor became predictable and productive. The labor of the people, enhanced by careful planning and ingenious tools, transformed the potential of the land into a steady supply of food, supporting a civilization that would endure for millennia. Ultimately, farming along the Nile was an interplay of human skill and natural bounty. The plows, sickles, baskets, shafts, and granaries were not merely objects. They were manifestations of centuries of experience, adaptation, and observation. Each tool told a story of problem-solving and ingenuity, a legacy of those who had cultivated the river's gifts long before and those who would continue to do so long after. The land, water, and labor were inseparable partners in a cycle that defined Egyptian life, ensuring that the Nile remained a lifeline for generations. Before the first light of dawn touched the Nile's waters, the villages along its banks were already stirring. Farmers rose early, guided by the soft glow of the stars and the faint sound of the river flowing. Their lives were dictated by the cycles of the Nile, and each day began with a careful assessment of the fields, the soil, and the weather. The air was cool, carrying the sense of damp earth and fresh vegetation, a reminder that life and labor were inseparably connected. Women began their day with the preparation of simple meals, flatbreads, dates, and dried fish, feeding their families before heading to tend the smaller tasks in the fields or near the homes. Men and older boys prepared plows, baskets, and tools for the day's labor. Even the youngest children were assigned responsibilities, such as carrying water, helping with seedlings, or tending small animals. These tasks taught responsibility, patience, and an intimate understanding of the land that would serve them throughout their lives. Once the sun rose higher, the rhythm of the day quickened. Plows moved steadily through the damp soil, oxen pulling with measured strength as farmers guided their movements. Every furrow was a line of hope, a careful planning of where seeds would be planted to yield the greatest harvest. Alongside them, workers used hoes and rakes to shape irrigation channels, loosen the soil, and remove weeds. Sweat glistened on foreheads. But there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the soil respond to their labor. Fertile and ready to sustain the next generation. Harvest time brought a different rhythm. Fields became alive with activity, as workers moved methodically through the crops. Sickles in hand, grain was cut, bundled, and carried to the edges of the fields, where it would be threshed and winnowed. Children played an essential role, helping to gather stalks, carry small bundles, and even observe the techniques of adults to learn the precision required for efficient work. Labor was hard, yet it was imbued with purpose and pride. Each bundle of grain represented months of effort and the promise of nourishment for the community, even during the most intense workdays. Moments of rest were carefully observed. Farmers would sit along the banks, drink from the Nile, and share simple meals with their companions. Stories, songs, and laughter filled these pauses, reinforcing the bonds between neighbors and family members. In these quiet moments, the community reminded itself that work alone was not enough. Resilience, cooperation, and shared knowledge were equally vital. Daily life on the farms was not without challenges. Unexpected floods, droughts, pests, and disease tested the community's skills and planning. Farmers had learned to anticipate these risks, building dikes, rotating crops, and storing surplus grain for lean seasons. Even when disaster struck, the resilience of the villagers, honed through generations of labor and observation, allowed them to recover and continue. This cycle of preparation, effort, and adaptation was a cornerstone of life along the Nile, teaching each generation the value of perseverance and ingenuity. Children's education was integrated into farm life. Learning to sow, irrigate, harvest, and manage livestock happened naturally through participation. Elders and parents taught by demonstration and storytelling, explaining why certain techniques worked, why timing mattered, and how the river dictated the rhythm of daily life. The combination of practice, observation, and oral instruction ensured that knowledge was preserved and passed down without the need for written texts. Though hieroglyphs were used in temples and records, even leisure was intertwined with work. Festivals, communal meals, and games occurred alongside planting and harvesting seasons, creating a balance between labor and joy. Music, dance, and storytelling were not merely entertainment, they were extensions of cultural memory and agricultural wisdom, reminding villagers of the reasons behind their routines. In this way, resilience was not only physical but also social and cultural, rooted in both the practical and emotional fabric of daily life. By nightfall, the village would quiet down, but the work never truly ceased. Water channels needed attention, animals had to be fed, and tools required maintenance, even in rest. The farmers were aware of the delicate balance between effort and reward. Sleep was a brief interlude in the continuous cycle of observation, labor, and renewal, essential to sustaining life along the Nile. Through this daily rhythm, the Egyptians mastered a life of balance. Labor was structured, predictable, and guided by experience, but it required constant attention and adaptation. The river dictated much of this rhythm, but human ingenuity ensured that each day was productive and that the community thrived. The lives of these farmers were intertwined with the soil, the water, and each other, creating a tapestry of resilience and knowledge that spanned generations. After the harvest, the Egyptians faced a critical challenge, ensuring that the fruits of their labor would last through the dry months and periods of scarcity. Storage and preservation were as important as the planting, irrigation, and harvesting themselves. Without proper care, grain could spoil, seeds could lose viability, and the hard work of months could be wasted. Therefore, innovative methods and careful planning were essential to protect the harvest. Granaries, or storage houses, were built using mud bricks, elevated slightly above ground to prevent water damage during unexpected floods. The walls were thick and insulated, providing protection against both heat and cold. Ventilation shafts allowed air to circulate, reducing the risk of mold, while narrow entrances limited access to protect against theft. Inside, grain was often stored in large clay jars or woven baskets, sometimes layered with straw to cushion and further preserve the kernels. Attention to detail in the design of storage spaces reflected a deep understanding of environmental conditions. Farmers recognized that moisture, pests, and temperature fluctuations could destroy large quantities of grain if not controlled. Elevated floors, airtight containers, and regular inspections were routine practices that ensured long-term preservation. These strategies not only saved food for human consumption but also maintained seed quality for the next planting season, creating a cycle of sustainability. Preservation extended beyond grain. Fruits and vegetables were sun-dried or stored in cool, shaded areas to extend their shelf life. Fish and meat were salted or dried to prevent decay. Even beer, which was a staple for nutrition and hydration, had to be carefully managed. Brewing techniques ensured it could be stored without spoiling, providing sustenance during periods when fresh food was less available. The process of storage also demanded organization and record-keeping. Farmers and overseers maintained careful accounts of what had been harvested, how much was stored, and where it was located. This allowed them to plan for future planting, allocate resources efficiently, and ensure that the community could survive periods of low productivity. Knowledge passed down from elders taught that storing too little could leave families hungry, while storing too much could lead to waste if the grain spoiled. Balance and foresight were key. Community involvement played a role as well. Families often worked together to transport grain from fields to granaries, a labor-intensive task requiring coordination and trust. Villages developed systems to share surplus, assisting those who had less or whose fields had failed. This cooperative approach reinforced social bonds and emphasized the interdependence of all members of the community. The Egyptians also developed techniques to deter pests, which posed a constant threat. Cats were kept to control rodents, while nets and barriers protected grain stores from birds. Smoke from controlled fires sometimes drove insects away, and natural repellents were used when possible. Each measure demonstrated careful observation of the environment and a willingness to adapt tools and methods to meet practical needs. Storing and preserving the harvest was more than a practical necessity, it was a cultural practice imbued with knowledge and tradition. Rituals often accompanied the process, expressing gratitude for the river's bounty and asking for continued fertility in the coming seasons. While they acknowledged Allah as the one true God, Egyptians still respected the cycles of nature and the wisdom of their ancestors, integrating these lessons into daily labor. Through careful storage, the Egyptians ensured that their hard work paid off, providing nourishment and security. Granaries and preservation techniques were not merely practical structures. They were a testament to human ingenuity, observation, and collective effort. They represented the link between labor, community, and the cycles of the Nile, ensuring that each generation could continue to thrive. The legacy of these methods endured for centuries. Even in modern times, the principles of careful storage, protection from pests, and strategic planning remain essential in agriculture. For the Egyptians, these practices were a lifeline, safeguarding both survival and prosperity, and demonstrating that the success of civilization depended as much on the knowledge of preservation as on the act of cultivation itself. As the sun set over the Nile, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the villages along the river reflected a harmony between nature and human effort. Generations of farmers had worked tirelessly to understand the rhythms of the river, the soil, and the seasons. They had learned to plant and harvest, store and preserve, adapt to floods and droughts, and organize their communities in ways that allowed life to flourish despite uncertainty. Daily routines, once simple tasks of sowing seeds, tending animals, and maintaining canals, were now part of a complex system of knowledge passed down from elders to children. The land, the river, and the labor of countless individuals were intertwined, forming a network of interdependence that sustained entire communities. Each season, each challenge, and each harvest was a lesson in resilience, patience, and cooperation. The legacy of these agricultural societies endured in more than just their crops. It lived in their careful observations of the natural world, their innovative techniques, and their ability to transform challenges into opportunities. The Nile was not merely a river, it was a teacher, a guide, and a source of life. The knowledge that had been honed over centuries ensured that every generation could thrive, even when the river's behavior was unpredictable. Children grew up understanding that life required effort, foresight, and cooperation. Women and men, young and old, contributed in ways that were practical and essential. Yet each role carried respect and significance. Seasonal rhythms dictated work, but culture, ritual, and community bound everyone together, creating a shared sense of purpose and belonging. As night fell and stars reflected in the gentle ripples of the river, families rested, secure in the knowledge that their community had adapted, survived, and prepared for the future. The lessons of the Nile, of careful observation, hard work, and unity, were embedded in the very soil they cultivated. These lessons would endure long after individual lives had passed, forming the foundation of a civilization whose sophistication rivaled the majesty of the river itself. Reflecting on their lives, one could see that the true strength of Egyptian society was not merely in its monuments, pyramids, or temples, but in the day-to-day practices of ordinary people. Farmers, laborers, and families had created a rhythm of life that honored both the river and the land, demonstrating an understanding of balance, resilience, and foresight. Their labor was sacred not in a religious sense, but in its ability to sustain generations, nurture communities, and forge a lasting connection with the environment. Ultimately, Life along the Nile was a testament to human ingenuity and adaptation, through centuries of trial and observation. The Egyptians had learned to thrive in a land that could be both generous and unforgiving. The story of the Nile is a story of patience, labor, and continuity, a reminder that civilization is built not only by grand monuments, but also by the quiet, steady work of people who understand their world and respect its rhythms. And so, the river flowed, as it had for millennia, carrying with it the memories, knowledge, and legacy of those who had lived, worked, and dreamed along its banks. The cycle of life continued. And with each passing season, the lessons of the Nile endured. A timeless reflection of human perseverance and the enduring power of harmony with nature.